Hello everyone, how's it going? It is Theonor as always, and continuing with this series, I'm going to take a look at the lore of Cataclysm this time. As a reminder, this video is basically a very opinionated look at 5 things I dislike about the lore of an expansion, and 5 things I like about it, in addition to a small discussion on what I think of the overall direction of the story of said expansion. Now, as I always do, to reiterate some things, this is just my opinion, you are free to disagree. I will only address the in-game lore, not expanded universe works, which took place in the timeline of this expansion, and boy, there are a lot for this expansion. And those 5 things I like and the 5 I dislike are not the only things I like or dislike about the expansion, it's just sort of an artificial limitation making me narrow my choices. Although I have to say that, for this expansion in particular, there are a lot of small things that I really like, small details or bits of information which do bear mentioning, but unfortunately I will have to abstain because the rules are the rules. Also, the things I will mention are not in any particular order, so it won't be leading up to the thing I dislike or like most, for instance. As I mentioned in my previous video, I'll be changing the structure a little bit, so it'll go from one thing I dislike to one thing I like, one thing I dislike, one I like, and so on and so forth. Again, as always, I will begin by talking a little about the general direction of the expansion story. Now, the overall direction of Cataclysm's story is, well, the fact that the world is on fire and that the apocalypse is happening. I wonder when will that get old? Anyway, I think Cataclysm is the expansion I like the most in terms of overall story, since it advanced the story of the entire world of Azeroth as a whole, rather than just focusing on one continent and or one specific threat. It really was, in many ways, a monumental undertaking by Blizzard to remake the entire world in order to progress the story, and really show the impact Deathwing and the Cataclysm had, and is something to be appreciated for. And of course, many of these smaller things I like, but which didn't make it into this video, are things related to the remaking of the world in Cataclysm. As to the overall story, I personally liked it, pretty much in its entirety, up to and including the death of Deathwing. There are some criticisms which can be raised in regards to the story, which are understandable, mostly in regards to Thrall's involvement, but I personally don't dislike them. I think Thrall's participation in the story made sense and allowed for an interesting change to his character, though I will admit that it is a bit difficult for me to explain it to people who don't know the lore that well. Anyway, the point is, Thrall won't be featuring in any like or dislike in this video, and that is why. Other than him, like I said, I generally liked the overall storyline of this expansion, and I really liked how varied the forces of the old gods were. So we didn't focus during every single patch on Deathwing or the Black Dragons, but we also fought Elementals, Faceless Ones, the Twilight's Hammer, and so on and so forth. Now, in regards to the minions of the old gods, I have to say the first thing I dislike is how unimpressive, I suppose you could say, Cho'gall's death was. I mean, yes, the raid fight was cool, and his appearances throughout the expansion were alright, but Cho'gall was really the perfect opportunity to have characters from, say, the comics show up. Garona does show up in the Twilight Highlands, where she is seen hunting down Cho'gall, but she fails in the zone and disappears afterwards, having no involvement whatsoever in the raid. Even leaving aside the comics, which are a mixed bag admittedly, Garona, in my opinion, should have had a lot more to do in this expansion, or at least in that raid than in regards to Cho'gall's storyline. Speaking of Garona, the first thing on the like column of this video are that we finally meet Malfurion in World of Warcraft, and Cenarius, and Alakir, and Pharazane, and Neptulon, and Deathwing, and Gerard Shadowsong. You get what I mean. As someone who was really into the lore, I found it to be really exciting that we finally got to meet all these important characters and the backstory of Warcraft in the actual game. We also finally got to see Mount Hydro in the game, we got to see the Elemental Plains, we got to see Gilneas and the part of Kazan. In a way, it was a fan service expansion for the lore people, but in a good way, not in a condescending kind of way. And I have to say, all of these cool individual lore characters and zones found their place in the story of the expansion and of World of Warcraft. Unlike, for example, some of the similar fan service of Burning Crusade, for instance, which failed for various reasons. On the topic of important lore people, the next thing I dislike was the ending of Neptulon's storyline in Cataclysm. The story really ended on a big cliffhanger, as you can imagine, with the Naga now supposedly having control of the most powerful elemental lord on Azeroth, and we don't hear from them again for a few years, and then suddenly he's fine in Legion. Now originally the situation was meant to be solved in the Abyssal Maw raid, which was supposed to come out during Cataclysm, but was unfortunately scrapped, which left behind, as Chris Metzen himself put it, a damn mess. Now in general, I would be happy to avoid the trope of, oh, the players solve every problem in the world, but this leaves the story as at best unresolved and at worst nonsensical. Though I will say that I did also have a bit of a problem with the most powerful elemental lord among them being taken down by a kraken, even if he was the most powerful of the kraken. That's still not really a good way to solve the storyline. Now the next thing I like would be the Aldermen and the Tol'vir storyline, which admittedly might be down more to my personal taste than anything else. Now, as you may or may not know, I am a big history fan. In fact, I am a history student in real life. So I like the zone, which was obviously based on ancient Egypt, and of course the technology of the Tol'vir, if not the people themselves. But what I really liked is how they managed to represent the Tol'vir as, well, closer to an actual civilization, I suppose you could say, rather than the somewhat cartoonish feel civilizations have in Warcraft. I mean, really, a few pig farms and some cactus fruits in-game Durotar are supposed to feed a city as large as Orgrimmar. In that sense, I like that the Tol'vir were not just the two capital cities, one for the good guys and one for the bad guys, but had numerous smaller towns and villages, along with farms to really illustrate that society, even if perhaps it's just a sort of parody of ancient Egypt. As to the storyline itself, I quite liked it. It explored the society of the Tol'vir very well and provided an interesting story as well, of the Tol'vir that wanted to return to stone even at the cost of forsaking their duty to the Titans. And admittedly, I did really like the the Harrison Jones storyline as well. Speaking of sand places, I guess, the next thing I disliked was that they didn't have time to finish some of the zone storylines that they decided to revamp in Cataclysm. Now it's understandable in a way since it was a pretty monumental undertaking in a relatively limited amount of time, and yes, a zone like Silithus and Ahn'Qiraj, while it could prove relevant to the story, is nonetheless perhaps more easily ignored. But I find it unfortunate that, with all the fans of Stromgarde out there, they didn't manage to revamp the Arathi Highlands in time, leaving it more or less the same as it was before. And of course there are also some Alliance storylines which were left unfinished, which did contribute a bit to the feel that the Alliance was ignored as a faction when compared to the Horde overall. The next thing I like would be the whole interaction of the dragons and the storylines of the specific dragonflights in Cataclysm. Now Cataclysm in many ways, especially when it comes to its endgame, is probably the expansion that had the most to do with dragons. And like I said, I pretty much like all the lore we got on them. I liked seeing the green dragonflight involved in the defense of Nordrassil, the red dragonflight taking an active role in combating the black dragonflight, especially in the Twilight Highlands, the inner struggle for power within the blue dragonflight, and the bronzes dealing with the return of Nosdormu and finding out how they can contribute to the end of Deathwing in the end. It all, in my opinion, came together quite well and provided for great character development for all of the aspects, and for a great number of lesser dragons as well. Now I'm going to talk about my last 2 dislikes together and then my last 2 likes, since the 2 likes and one of the dislikes pretty much can be tied together. Now my penultimate dislike was the betrayal of Archbishop Benedictus. Now that isn't a dislike in and of itself, I actually quite like it, and I like his character when he was evil. What I dislike is that he has no build-up, so to say. There were no signs to show that he was turning to evil, or considering evil, or whatever. It's something even Blizzard themselves admitted, that they would have preferred to give a bit more story to why he turned evil. And my final dislike would be that we didn't have any Dark Trolls or Skarden in Cataclysm. The Dark Trolls and the Skarden are, in my opinion, two of the more interesting minor races of Azeroth, and they were supposed to appear in Cataclysm since there is even concept art for them. The Dark Trolls had their home in Mount Hyjo and the Skarden inhabited Grim Batol, so it made sense for them to appear. But unfortunately, they wound up being scrapped for an unknown reason. And speaking of Grim Batol, my penultimate like would be the Dragonmaw clan and their activities in the Twilight Highlands. I have to say honestly that the Twilight Highlands remain one of my favorite zones in the game, precisely because of the Dragonmaw clan. They are in many ways one of the coolest of the orc clans out there, and they even continue enslaving dragons and are even provided an actual method by which they enslave dragons, unlike the Dragonmaw in Outland. Warlord Zayla was also one of the cooler orc characters, and honestly I think nobody was expecting freaking Overlord Morgor to show up at the beginning of the Dragonmaw questline. And the final thing I like is Garrosh Hellscream and his portrayal in Cataclysm. With Garrosh in Cataclysm, you really got the sense, as a Horde player, that things were finally moving, that he would make the Horde great and make it have a glorious destiny, and in Cataclysm, Garrosh wasn't a half-bad war chief. He was willing to learn from his mistakes, he was honorable, and was determined to bring a better future for the entire Horde. It's interesting that at the most recent BlizzCon, they were asked about how they sort of developed their characters, and they answered, in regards to Garrosh, that they always envisioned him having a grand destiny. And you can see that in Cataclysm, that destiny was to lead the Horde to a bright future, to be a better orc than his father was, especially now that Thrall found his true path with shamanism. But then they decided to turn him evil, and his character did, well, not a complete 180, but still a pretty sudden shift in Mists of Pandaria. But I digress. Garrosh Hellscream in Cataclysm was a great war chief and a great development to the story in my opinion. So I suppose this is the end of this particular video. Leave any thoughts in the comments below, but please don't crucify me over my opinion on Thrall. And I'll see you all later. Farewell.